The Escape. A short story by Katherine Mansfield. It was his fault, wholly and solely his fault, that they had missed the train. What if the idiotic hotel people had refused to produce the bill? Wasn't that simply because he hadn't impressed upon the waiter at lunch that they must have it by 2 o'clock? Any other man would have sat there and refused to move until they handed it over. But no, his exquisite belief in human nature had allowed him to get up and expect one of those idiots to bring it to their room. And then, when the voiture did arrive, while they were still, oh heavens, waiting for change, why hadn't he seen to the arrangement of the boxes so that they could, at least, have started the moment the money had come? Had he expected her to go outside, to stand under the awning in the heat and point with her parasol? Very amusing picture of English domestic life. Even when the driver had been told how fast he had to drive, he had paid no attention whatsoever. Just smiled. Oh, she groaned. If she'd been a driver, she couldn't have stopped smiling herself at the absurd, ridiculous way he was urged to hurry. And she sat back and imitated his voice. Allez, vite, vite, and begged the driver's pardon for troubling him. And then the station, unforgettable, with the sight of the jaunty little train shuffling away and those hideous children waving from the windows. Oh, why am I made to bear these things? Why am I exposed to them? The glare, the flies while they waited, and he and the station master put their heads together over the timetable trying to find this other train, which of course they wouldn't catch. The people who'd gathered round, and the woman who'd held up that baby with that awful, awful head. Oh, to care as I care, to feel as I feel, and never to be saved anything, never to know for one moment what it was to... Her voice had changed. It was shaking now, crying now. She fumbled with her bag and produced from its little maw a scented handkerchief. She put up her veil and, as though she were doing it for somebody else, pitifully as though she was saying to somebody else, "I know, my darling," she pressed the handkerchief to her eyes. The little bag, with its shiny silvery jaws open, lay on her lap. He could see her powder puff, her rouge stick, a bundle of letters, a file of tiny black pills like seeds, a broken cigarette, a mirror, white ivory tablets with lists on them that had been heavily scored through. He thought, in Egypt she would be buried with those things. They had left the last of the houses, those small, straggling houses with bits of broken pot, flung among the flower beds and half-naked hens scratching round the doorsteps. Now they were mounting a long, steep road that wound round the hill and over into the next bay. The horses stumbled, pulling hard. Every 5 minutes, every 2 minutes, the driver trailed the whip across them. His stout back was solid as wood. There were boils on his reddish neck, and he wore a shining new straw hat. There was a little wind, just enough wind to blow to satin the new leaves on the fruit trees, to stroke the fine grass, to turn to silver the smoky olives. Just enough wind to start in front of the carriage a whirling, twirling snatch of dust that settled on their clothes like the finest ash. When she took out her powder puff, the powder came flying over them both. Oh, the dust, she breathed, the disgusting, revolting dust. And she put down her veil and lay back as if overcome. "Why don't you put up your parasol?" he suggested. It was on the front seat and he leaned forward to hand it to her. At that, she suddenly sat upright and blazed again. "Please leave my parasol alone. I don't want my parasol." And anyone who was not utterly insensitive would know that I'm far, far too exhausted to hold up a parasol, and with a wind like this tugging at it. "Put it down at once," she flashed, and then snatched the parasol from him, tossed it into the crumpled hood behind, and subsided, panting. Another bend of the road, and down the hill there came a troop of little children, shrieking and giggling, little girls with sun-bleached hair, little boys in faded soldiers' caps. In their hands they carried flowers, any kind of flowers, grabbed by the head, and these they offered, running beside the carriage. Lilac, faded lilac, greeny-white snowballs, one arum lily, a handful of hyacinths. They thrust the flowers and their impish faces into the carriage. One even threw into her lap a bunch of marigolds. Poor little mice. He had his hand in his trouser pocket before her. For heaven's sake, don't give them anything. Oh, how typical of you. Horrid little monkeys. Now they'll follow us all the way. Don't encourage them. You would encourage beggars. And she hurled the bunch out of the carriage with, "Well, do it when I'm not there, please." He saw the queer shock on the children's faces. They stopped running, lagged behind, and then they began to shout something and went on shouting until the carriage had rounded yet another bend. Oh, how many more are there before the top of the hill is reached? The horses haven't trotted once. Surely it isn't necessary for them to walk the whole way. "We shall be there in a minute now," he said, and took out his cigarette case. At that, she turned round towards him. She clasped her hands and held them against her breast. Her dark eyes looked immense, imploring behind her veil. Her nostrils quivered, she bit her lip, and her head shook with a little nervous spasm. But when she spoke, her voice was quite weak and very, very calm. "I want to ask you something. I want to beg something of you," she said. "I have asked you hundreds and hundreds of times before, but you've forgotten. It's such a little thing, but if you knew what it meant to me." She pressed her hands together. "But you can't know. No human creature could know and be so cruel." And then, slowly, deliberately, gazing at him with those huge, somber eyes, "I beg and implore you for the last time that when we are driving together, you won't smoke. If you could imagine," she said, "the anguish I suffer when that smoke comes floating across my face." "Very well," he said. "I won't. I forgot." And he put the case back. "Oh no," said she, and almost began to laugh, and put the back of her hand across her eyes. "You couldn't have forgotten. Not that." The wind came, blowing stronger. They were at the top of the hill. "Hoy, yip, yip, yip," cried the driver. They swung down the road that fell into a small valley, skirted the seacoast at the bottom of it, and then coiled over a gentle ridge on the other side. Now there were houses again, blue-shuttered against the heat, with bright burning gardens, with geranium carpets flung over the pinkish walls. The coastline was dark. On the edge of the sea, a white, silky fringe just stirred. The carriage swung down the hill, bumped, shook. "Yirip!" shouted the driver. She clutched the sides of the seat. She closed her eyes, and he knew she felt this was happening on purpose. This swinging and bumping, this was all done, and he was responsible for it, somehow, to spite her because she had asked if they couldn't go a little faster. But just as they reached the bottom of the valley, there was one tremendous lurch. The carriage nearly overturned, and he saw her eyes blaze at him, and she positively hissed, "I suppose you are enjoying this." They went on. They reached the bottom of the valley. Suddenly she stood up. "Kosher! Kosher! Arrêtez-vous!" She turned round and looked into the crumpled hood behind. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "I knew it. I heard it fall, and so did you, at that last bump." "What? Where?" "My parasol, it's gone. The parasol that belonged to my mother. The parasol that I prize more than... She was simply beside herself. The driver turned round, his gay, broad face smiling. "I too heard something," said he simply and gaily. "But I thought as Monsieur and Madame said nothing." "There! You hear that? Then you must have heard it too. So that accounts for the extraordinary smile on your face." "Look here," he said. "It can't be gone. If it fell out, it will be there still. Stay where you are. I'll fetch it." But she saw through that. Oh, how she saw through it. "No, thank you." And she bent her spiteful, smiling eyes upon him, regardless of the driver. "I'll go myself. I'll walk back and find it and trust you not to follow." For, knowing the driver did not understand, she spoke softly, gently. "If I don't escape from you for a minute, I shall go mad." She stepped out of the carriage. "My bag." He handed it to her. "Madame prefers—" But the driver had already swung down from his seat and was seated on the parapet reading a small newspaper. The horses stood with hanging heads. It was still. The man in the carriage stretched himself out, folded his arms. He felt the sun beat on his knees. His head was sunk on his breast. "Hish, hish," sounded from the sea. The wind sighed in the valley and was quiet. He felt himself lying there, a hollow man, a parched, withered man, as it were, of ashes. And the sea sounded, hish, hish. It was then that he saw the tree, that he was conscious of its presence just inside a garden gate. It was an immense tree with a round, thick silver stem and a great arc of copper leaves that gave back the light, and yet were sombre. There was something beyond the tree, a whiteness, a softness, an opaque mass, half hidden, with delicate pillars. As he looked at the tree, he felt his breathing die away and he became part of the silence. It seemed to grow, it seemed to expand in the quivering heat, until the great carved leaves hid the sky, and yet it was motionless. Then from within its depths or from beyond there came the sound of a woman's voice. A woman was singing. The warm, untroubled voice floated upon the air, and it was all part of the silence as he was part of it. Suddenly, as the voice rose, soft, dreaming, gentle, he knew that it would come floating to him from the hidden leaves, and his peace was shattered. What was happening to him? Something stirred in his breast. Something dark, something unbearable and dreadful pushed in his bosom, and like a great weed, it floated, rocked. It was warm, stifling. He tried to struggle to tear at it, and at the same moment, all was over. Deep, deep, he sank into the silence, staring at the tree and waiting for the voice that came, floating, falling, until he felt himself enfolded. In the shaking corridor of the train, it was night. The train rushed and roared through the dark. He held on with both hands to the brass rail. The door of their carriage was open. "Do not disturb yourself, monsieur. He will come in and sit down when he wants to. He likes. He likes. It is his habit." "Oui, madame. Je suis un peu souffrante. Mais nurse. Oh, but my husband is never so happy as when he is travelling. He likes roughing it. My husband, my husband." The voices murmured, murmured. They were never still. But so great was his heavenly happiness as he stood there, he wished he might live forever.